moves us on quite nicely, I guess, to diversity and inclusion, and particularly in the energy sector, which I know is something that's one of your sort of key areas. First up, energy. What attracted you to the energy sector?
I wanted to do something about climate change. So it's principles led for me, and then there's an emotional heft, which is I want to do something about climate change, and then there's a kind of rational, logical space too, which is I just love the problem solving of it. I love the complexity of the industry, the engineering, the technologies, the way it underpins the rest of the economy, the kind of that political social importance to the sector as well. So intellectually I find it really challenging. Emotionally it's because we're in the middle of, as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing that humanity's got to deal with over the period of my lifetime, and I feel useful, and I feel like the sector's useful. So
that's a very nice summary, because it makes me feel useful is a brilliant way of putting that. It's also a phenomenally exciting time. So I've talked to some sort of grid engineers who are coming to the end of their career and they're gutted. So the last 15 years, it has become a transition, right? Before it was like, just keep the wires up. And that makes it a really exciting sector to work in. So I'm going to ask you probably a slightly cliche question. What would your advice be to young people looking looking for a career in energy?
Oh, it's exactly as you describe. We're on this, I think, actually multi-generational tipping point. I think that people tend to think about the energy transition as being about this next phase of kind of energy technologies, but fundamentally I think we're talking about a rewiring of the economy around a new set of technologies and the services they provide and the way that they operate, which we probably haven't seen since the internal combustion engine, where we restructured entire societies around the change in mobility that technology created. Renewables and the cheap electrons they produce will dominate energy systems, and the technologies on the other end of the system, like EVs and electrified heating and smart technologies that can aggregate those things up, just very, very different. And energy, as we're finding out right now, underpins the economy. So it's joining. You'll get to be kind of one of the new industrialists. This is like being the Victorians that pioneered the age of steam. That's
Can
the
be
kind
Brunel for electrons.
Yeah, it's that. Yeah. Like, there's going to be someone we're working alongside who's that person. That's this generation of energy engineers and specialists and policymakers. That is the game. It's that big. I genuinely believe that. So that's the kind of the intellectual part of my brain. On the heart piece, I don't think you have to convince the generation coming through that climate change is something worth doing. In fact, I'd argue that if we haven't tackled it in some ways by the time they really start work, then we're in trouble. We've probably got 10 years to really, bend the emissions curve. So, emotionally being part of that moral mission will often do it if being the next, as by Kingdom Brunel doesn't appeal. But it's a
Isabella
sector to be in.
Kingdom
Yeah,
Brunel.
Isabella. Yeah, well, quite.
And that brings me neatly on. I guess historically, energy sector engineers have been predominantly male.
I have not noticed that in the time I've been working in the industry.
We need more diversity because it brings fresh thinking, etc. And I know that's something that's very important to you. So I want to ask you, what policies and procedures have you seen that have proved very successful for this? I saw yesterday you've hired Dara from Citizens Advice, who's a great hire. So congratulations on that.
Thanks.
But what sort of processes, policies do you recommend?
So this is partly my opinion, partly Energy UK's opinion, right? So just to note, I think when I started my career, and there are women in the sector, and as you say, the sector's still about 80% male overall, particularly in the technical roles or leadership roles. And that's a lot to do with stuff outside the sector's control. It's to do with kind of STEM education choices when people are younger, and the boxes we put children in very young. Me included, I didn't do an engineering degree for reasons that baffle me now, but some of this is not ours to fix. However, even when you've got two equally qualified candidates, we're finding that people aren't progressing or being hired. So there's a few things, I think. When I started my career, I was told mentoring and kind of soft support networks would help. So, it was all about talent identification, finding someone who is like you to hold your hand through your career journey and give you good careers advice. Now that works. It's a lovely thing to have. And I've got a group of, mostly women, essentially people with similar backgrounds and experiences to me, that it just gives me that wall of support I need when it's challenging because of who I am, not what I know. That said, I think over the last 10 years I've been working, the people understand that our measures have to be much firmer, that the soft stuff won't work, that just doing inclusivity without doing kind of hard measures to improve diversity doesn't work. So things we've tried, quotas. So we are signed up for all of our events, all our public communications, anything you see from us, to the BBC's 50-50 initiative, which means it has to be 50% men and women. I also worked on some of the quotas in things like the sector deal for offshore wind, and I know the nuclear industry had similar. Let me tell you, those deals would not have got over the line, government, if those quotas weren't in, for improving both gender diversity in the industry and Black and minority ethnic diversity too. So quotas are really helpful. I would encourage people to think about that, particularly with boards. When we're appointing board members or we're writing to speakers, we often ask them to think about diversity in the people that they put up for us. There's a relevant point. If you're senior, please give up your platform to other people to come through after you, because the people coming up after you will probably be more diverse and often more interesting. Both my previous bosses did that for me, and it's why I have this career now, right? So there's that bit of it. Other things in recruitment, we use blind CVs, so we often take names off, we take institutions off. For most roles, it's more difficult in an academic context, that one that I appreciate, but most of the time it does change your perception of candidates. So that's a good tip. We write inclusive job descriptions where we talk about flexible working up front. We offer people flexible working from day one, that they start with us, maternity and paternity cover from day one when they start with us, and share parental leave. So all of our kind of policies and corporate things that aim to improve diversity are there. And then other stuff too, like staff working groups or lunch and learns, again, the kind of soft stuff that's about inclusivity rather than quotas and kind of fixed measures for reporting. Lastly, I think the regulator may, in quieter times, start looking at companies to do better. So things like board governance and so on. I think they might actually start requiring us to consider it as some of our kind of fitness to operate. So we'll see. There you go. That was a very rough canter through. The institutions thing is a new one for me at Energy UK. My HR lead is brilliant, and she did it. And I will tell you that it's the first time I've seen CVs without the university names on. And I was really kind of like, about it for when they first came through. But and therefore I was looking, right? Like, so therefore it kind of mattered in some way. And we've got a great set of candidates through. So, I think these things are important in the long run, and often the reason good people will come and join you too if they see you trying.
Fantastic. There were a couple of things excuse me, a couple of things I'd like to take up there. You said the benefit of the mentoring is because of who you are, not what you know. I think it's probably actually a combination.
That's true.
And I think it's the importance of representation. You see people like you doing stuff at a very high level, garnering respect from everyone. And it's very powerful.
Our ex-communications director had this phrase, "You can't be what you can't see," which is, so we've got directories for diverse speakers. We run one at Energy UK. Renewable UK has one for women called the Switch List. And basically, again, it's a tool to help conference organisers identify people who are different, who self-nominate to be on the directories. But I do love that expression. I think my point is there's got to be more than just visibility, though. I think that's really important for people coming up after you. And role modelling is important. But the point about it's kind of who you are as well as what you know. Like I understand how basic transport infrastructure, I'll give you an example, functions at a kind of very high level. I understand how cities function. From the kind of engineering systems perspective, I understand transport systems. My view on transport systems changed hugely when I was at home on maternity leave, and I live in London. I live in the suburbs in London. There is no transport infrastructure that's any good that runs round the outside of the city.
It's in and out, yeah.
It's in and out, and it was designed that way to help mostly men then commute into their office and home, and now it's just useless for how we're all working. And it's always been useless for people who didn't have that work pattern, you know, mostly women at home with children, or carers, or anyone who is an essential worker traveling around the suburbs or their local community. Anyone who wasn't a bloke commuting to the city has not been well served by that infrastructure. No. But you don't really realise that until you're trying to get a pram through like King's Cross station at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, you know, and
or along pavements with cars half parked on, etc.
Yeah, trying to just negotiate your way around. Worse again for people who are disabled or who have different needs. So I think bringing your personal experiences of infrastructure and the way that you live and experience the world to a job which is fundamentally about designing the kind of future energy system is not a bad thing. Yeah.
No, 100%. So I've got a couple more questions on the diversity front. You mentioned you couldn't really tackle STEM teaching in schools, things of that nature. Is enough being done? What can be done to convince more diverse applicants, or I guess pupils at that point, to pursue STEM careers, STEM courses, etc.?
There is a role for the industry in explaining what the industry is about and making visible the kinds of professions we've got. And I'm really proud of a lot of my member companies, the work that they do in that regard, you know, both going out into schools, but also just the kind of material that they put out on their social media and how they kind of try and target people at careers fairs and all of that. I think it's really good. A couple of observations from that. Firstly, the national curriculum is a challenge for wanting to kind of go into schools and talk to people more broadly about, you know, engineering or energy or climate change or any of the things that are relevant, because it's so fixed, and schools are often, particularly in the states sector, find it very difficult to have the room to kind of have that kind of experience for their students, I think. And then although it doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and relatedly, when we were working on the sector deal, I think it was striking that it was very difficult for BEIS to join up with DFE, the Department for Education. And that's a challenge for not just students coming through and graduates, but also for things like reskilling and retraining. We know we're going to have to do a lot of that in the kind of future transition. So I'd love to see Whitehall crack that particular problem, get those departments working together. Lastly, there's a really good job for science communicators, and there's loads of really good science communicators. I follow someone called Raven, the science maven, on Twitter, who's she's I think she's Texan, black Texan, a biologist in the US, and she's just amazing. And the way that she talks about her subject is deliberately very different, and her entire objective is to get people from different backgrounds into the subject that she studies. So, and there's lots of science communicators that do that kind of thing too. So I think we need to liberate them to talk about their subject in ways which are relevant to them. I think, and this is just to finish on this, we have to be careful not to bash difference out of people as they progress, particularly for leadership and communication roles. And my entire career, people have worried about my gravitas. And what they mean by that is I don't look like a 50-year-old bloke in a suit. And that's, when we think about leaders and the way they communicate, my reverence, the way I dress, the way I look, the way I speak is very, very different to leadership that we're used to seeing. And it was very well-meant advice, and it was very helpful to think through how I present myself in different circumstances and so on. But I I've kind of tried to doggedly hold on to a little bit of what makes me different, but that's been tough sometimes, right? Performance reviews where people have been like, blah, and I've had to go, if that's actually genuinely a thing that's a problem, let's talk about it. But are you sure it is? Are you sure it's not just that it's just different? But
yeah,
I think
I'd class you as pioneering a new gravitas, if I'm honest. In appearance, Emma, we did our research, and the earliest footage we find of you on the internet, you're remarkably unchanged because that was some time ago. So yeah, you are certainly, you don't present as a 50-year-old bloke in a suit. That's very true.
No.
But I think there is, as I say, I think there yourself, I can think of other people in our industry who are kind of pioneering a new way of doing this, a new way of learning in that respect, which looks new and fresh, but it works, right?
And a lot of my board of 50-year-old blokes in suits, I've always worked with them. I found them to be supportive, and it is a model of leadership, right? But with what we're saying is, in our diverse sector, you need lots of different kinds of leadership, lots of different kinds of voices, and it's very tempting as people progress in their careers to fit them into the box you need them to be in as a business. And I think the challenge for our industry is, yes, they're going to have to do this role in this bit of the system, but should they have to look, speak, be a certain way to do that role? Can we allow them the space to do it in a way that's more meaningful for them or different? And certainly, can that difference be something we value in their progression, not try and flatten?
Squash, yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
That actually leads me quite neatly on to my final question, which I guess refers to the 50-year-old blokes and their younger colleagues as well. So we are still a majority male sector, as you say, you noticed. What's your advice to those men? You mentioned the experienced chaps who are at senior level is step away, allow more diverse younger people to come up and use your platform now and again. But how do because I'm sure the majority of men want to work in a more diverse industry. Yeah. How do they fulfil that role as allies? And do you see that ever in conflict at all with their own sort of career ambitions?
So if you are at the point that you are able to think about other people's progression, your role is safe. So this is the other thing I'd say is I realise that a lot of what I say is like, just be yourself and do your own thing. I will also admit that that's become easier for me as I've become more senior because it's hard to tell me off. And I think, therefore I'm trying to hang on to it because it's important for my junior colleagues to see it. But I'm not sure, earlier in your career, I'd be advising people to take the same level of risk that I'm allowed to do now. You mentioned my Twitter, for example, which is a perennial risk, I think. So at the point that you're senior enough to be thinking about it, you're fine, your career is fine, it is not going to damage your progression or your reputation to step aside for other people to come through. And I think there is an incredible kind of leadership that has the humility to do that. And in particular, in both my previous bosses, in fact all my bosses have been men, including now John Hutton, and all of them have given me room to shape my team and my role my way. A huge amount of devolved responsibility. They've given me additional responsibility when they can see that I need it. And they've often, I think, I've never asked them, but gone to bat for me when there've been skeptical voices about that, because of my, age, experience, Twitter feed, all of those things. And so, championing people you think are talented and giving them space, important. And then just the humility also to give them your public space, I think is remarkable. And in particular in this regard, my former boss, Hugh McNeil, who was the chief executive of Renewable UK, just allowed me to be the primary spokesperson for that organisation. And as a consequence, lost me to Energy UK. He was willing to take that risk and allow me to develop my career at the expense of, himself or his business. And I think it's remarkable. It's very rare in a chief exec for someone to have that humility to be like, this person's actually good at this, and I want them to take on that bit of the role. So I think that's really important. The reason I mention that and focus on it is, in particular for visibility, it's very rare to find senior people who are also diverse. That will change over time, but at the moment our executive teams and our leadership tend to be a little bit homogenous. That doesn't mean that their voices aren't worth hearing or that they're not valuable or going to have successful careers. But I think it's important for the point you make about increasing visibility of diverse candidates and bringing therefore more diverse people through, that people step aside. And in my experience of organising conferences or media performances or anything for industry, often people want to put up their senior spokespeople, and then it's very difficult for a conference organizer to write back and say to someone very senior, we don't want you, we'd love a diverse candidate who's not you, do you have anyone less senior? And I think therefore it's got to be senior people that say, you know, I'm conscious that you might be looking at diversity, conscious that you might want different voices. What's the rest of the panel like? Would you like me to step aside? I've got this brilliant person you could speak to instead. So
it's very hard for junior staff to pie off their CEO or something and say
yeah,
no,
exactly
they don't want you, so we're sending someone else. Yeah,
and the same for event organisers or anyone. Like it's still seen as the CEO's job, right, to be the primary spokesperson or a kind of leadership role. So, you know, it's going to take those individuals saying, actually, I've done quite a lot of this lately, or it looks like your conference could do with some new voices. How about? So I think that's the other thing I'd say is for people to think about their own platform and whether they can share it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Fantastic stuff.